Well, thank you very much for that wonderful introduction, and how happy I am to be here, and was pleased to hear the panel and how it's grappling with these complicated topics. There are no known answers to this problem yet, so I can sit down. This is the climate change issue is certainly the most complicated challenge that humanity as a whole has ever had to take on, because the problems go to the core of our economic system. Energy is the most important sector of a modern economy. Without it, there is no modern economy. And yet we have grown up for 200 years on a fossil fuel-based economy, which has been a great thing for the world, except that it could now ruin the world. That's the only footnote. And we don't have a clear pathway out of this. There's another problem, unfortunately, and that is that the time is short. If we could do what we heard of experimenting, trying something, and so forth, we would make it. But the problem is that we have already filled the atmosphere with greenhouse gases to a level beyond what we promised to do. We've already filled the atmosphere to a level of dangerous anthropogenic interference in the climate system. In other words, climate change is not something, as we used to talk about it 20 or 30 years ago, as something about our children and our children's children and the risks and so forth. It's here now. We've entered what the geologists call the age of the Anthropocene, meaning the period in Earth's history when a single species, and that would be us, has the major Earth dynamics under our strong and not so beneficial influence. And so humanity dominates major changes in the Earth's geology and the Earth's chemistry. The greenhouse gas emissions, of course, have already risen to a level that in past epochs of the world, ocean levels have been many meters higher than they are now, showing that we've already reached a level of human-induced change that, if it now unfolds over decades and perhaps centuries, with all of the feedbacks included, we've already fundamentally changed the planet. We've already emitted enough carbon dioxide to reduce the pH of the ocean by 0.1 unit, and we're on a path to reduce the pH by about 0.4 units, perhaps by mid-century. This could destroy a tremendous amount of the marine life around carbonate-needing species. So the ocean acidification, even aside from the climate change, and that is acidification coming from carbon dioxide dissolving in the ocean surface and affecting the carbonate bicarbonate balance, the buffering function of the ocean, is enough to do tremendous peril. There are a lot of other effects, but the point that I want to make is that we're already in the middle of things, and we have not yet succeeded mentally, we've not yet succeeded technologically, and we certainly have not yet succeeded politically in finding a way forward. So, the arithmetic is not all that complicated. It's the solutions that are complicated. The arithmetic is that the world economy is now a $70 trillion per year economy. If you add the production around the world, 7 billion people on average producing $10,000 per person, measured in common units of purchasing power. We use about 200 kilograms of oil equivalent energy for each $1,000 of GNP that's produced on the planet. It's not so different across all scales of poor to rich countries, actually, because energy scales with the level of production more or less proportionately. And for each ton or each kilogram, say, of oil equivalent energy unit, we emit about 2.4 kilograms of CO2. That's a measure of the energy, of the carbon intensity of our energy. We are a predominantly fossil fuel using world economy. And if you multiply the roughly, it's really about 190 kilograms per $1,000 of output times the roughly 2.4 kilograms per kilogram of oil equivalent energy, you find out that we use about 0.46 kg per dollar of GNP, or about 460 kilograms of CO2 emitted for every $1,000 of income. Multiply by 70 trillion, that turns out to be about 33 billion tons of CO2 that we emit per year. Given the holding capacity of the atmosphere, that's raising the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere by about 2.5 parts per million each year now. We went from about 280 parts per million in the pre-industrial era to about 395 parts per million now. And we're on a path of increasing roughly 2.5 parts per million each year. Now, what's dangerous? It depends who you ask. If you ask my colleague Jim Hansen, who I regard as our premier climate scientist in the United States, the one who takes the most flack and is a good, that's a good indication that he's the most important, the most clever, and the most accurate of all the climate scientists. He's also the one who 24 years ago told Congress for the first time what our planet would be like if we went on this way for another quarter century, and he nailed it almost to a decimal point what would happen. Hansen says that we already passed the safe level by about 45 parts per million. He puts the anthropogenic threshold at about 350 parts per million, because he says every time in Earth's history when we've been above that threshold, ocean levels have been several meters higher. So why aren't they higher now? They're not higher now because there are feedbacks that take time. For example, given the CO2 that we've emitted so far, the Earth's temperature has warmed by about 0.8 degrees centigrade. But if we allow even the relatively short feedbacks to complete from what we've already done, no more, just what we've done, we're going to have about twice that effect in warming. In other words, we've already warmed the planet by about 1.6 degrees C, but we've only observed about half of that so far because the ocean takes time to warm up. It's a big bathtub. It has a tremendous heat capacity. It's warming, but it's taking time. We've built in a global warming of about 1.6 degrees C, perhaps even a little bit bigger than that, even if we never emitted another ton. That's enough to change the planet. And as Hansen points out, if you take into account the longer-term feedbacks, the loss of ice, changing the albedo or the reflectance of the Earth's surface, possible degassing of CO2 from deep oceans, methane from permafrost, and other kinds of feedbacks, which the planet does in its highly nonlinear way and has done each time CO2 has been this concentrated, then we're talking about a massive change of the planet and a massive change of sea level and a massive change of ocean chemistry and a massive loss of species diversity for what we've already done. We tell ourselves it's okay, we have time, maybe we'll get to 450, that's okay, what's a couple degrees centigrade among friends? We have, of course, our leading business newspaper in this country, the Wall Street Journal, incredibly propounding myths every day, a direct anti-scientific propaganda page on the editorial page, at the same time that it's a wonderful newspaper. You can't do without it. It's got great news stories, and then it's got this wonderful 3-page fiction section, too. And so it's extremely entertaining, but it's actually extremely damaging as well, because we're already into the midst of this. And this year, it's incredible, by the way. This year, we had our 12 warmest months in U.S. history, July 2011 to July 2012. We had the single warmest month of all of U.S. history, which was July 2012. We've had the worst drought in modern history that has done great damage to the corn crop in this country. Food prices are soaring. We have a presidential campaign going on, which is why I was late, because crossing from the west side to the east side was nearly impossible for a half an hour. And you know how much this issue has been mentioned? I think one speech in one paragraph. Because we have willful neglect because of the power of the lobbies in this country and the terror of the politicians at the hands of lobbies, because these politicians' main job is to raise money to run advertisements. And that costs a lot of money, and the oil companies have a lot of money. And so here we are in the middle of this disaster, and we can't even talk about it in this country. Now, if we could talk about it, we'd find out, God, this is hard. What are we going to do? Because the fact of the matter is this is not in the U.S. hands, even though the U.S. remains the largest economy, at least for a few more years. China may overtake the United States by 2017 or 2018 in total purchasing power. China's already well overtaken the United States in total carbon emissions and will probably never look back. China's by far the largest emitter, and its emissions continue to rise dramatically because with all of the innovative renewable energy projects that China's doing and with all of the nuclear plants that China's building, China is also increasing massively its use of coal. It's building massively its coal-fired utilities because China is basically a coal-rich country. And what it can't get domestically, it's importing from Australia. The developing countries as a whole are now in the driver's seat of the world climate in the future. They say, why should we do anything? The most powerful country in the world, the United States, the richest country, the one with the highest per capita emissions of any major economy, doesn't do anything. Why should we do anything? We need to catch up. We're still poor. We're still only 1/5 the per capita income of the United States. Why look to us? We just happen to have a lot of people. But they have a point, except that this kind of relentless prisoner's dilemma logic, you first, thank you, no, I'll do it after you, is just going to wreck the planet. And we're already in the midst of wrecking the planet. I should just say, before I turn to a couple of the possible solutions and pathways, that it's not just things like the heat wave in Europe that we read about, or which did take many, many lives, or the crop failures this year. There's already devastation occurring in the drier parts of the world, especially in Africa, in the Horn of Africa and the Sahel. Nobody knows for sure, but the evidence seems to be that the warming of the Indian Ocean has pulled the rainfall off the coast of East Africa into the Indian Ocean, and it's led to a significant drying of what is already one of the driest places in the world. That is Ethiopia, Somalia, northern Uganda, northern Kenya, and so forth. And there have been horrendous droughts in recent years, and then lots of violence, lots of extremism, Al-Qaeda, and then the drone missiles fly, and we're into a kind of mind-boggling spiral of places in the world becoming almost uninhabitable. And then instead of working on their resiliency, building bore wells, and helping with agriculture and so forth, what we have is war taking over. In West Africa, it's a similar story, different underlying mechanism, but also the Sahel has faced a massive drought this year, and we already lost one country to collapse, that's Mali, which faced a coup in the south and an insurrection in the north and tremendous violence and tremendous tragedy in the midst of all of this. So if there's any message, don't be complacent. And don't think we're going to work it all out, and don't think we're going to learn and everything's fine and we'll get our act together, because our capacity to wreck things is very high because we're really productive. And the world economy is growing, and there's lots of fossil fuel, and every time we find a new way to dig it up, we burn it. And so we have the joy of the hydrofracking boom right now, and we'll take our oil sands and our oil shales, and anything we can find to burn, we burn. And if we do that, we will completely wreck the planet. And we're already well advanced in doing that. So that's the problem. Now, what's the solution? Of course, the solution is we need alternatives. We have lots of candidates. We need to decarbonize the global energy system. So it's easy to state. By 2050, today's world economy of $70 trillion should be, if we're successful in development, maybe $200 trillion worldwide, allowing poor countries to grow. They will need a tremendous amount of energy. Even if we're highly energy efficient, the need for primary energy is going to grow on this planet tremendously. The key is for it to be low carbon energy. There are basically two ways to do that. One is to use primary energy sources that are not coal, oil, gas, or things like it, the shales and so forth. So that could be renewables, wind, solar, geothermal, could be nuclear. And the alternative is to use fossil fuels, but to clean up after ourselves through carbon capture and sequestration. And there are two logical chains of carbon capture and sequestration. One is to capture the CO2 as you burn it at power plants and sequester it safely geologically. And the other, which one of my colleagues is working very hard to do, is to try to capture the CO2 directly from the air. That's a little more expensive because you have a pretty diffuse, diluted stream of CO2. It's only 395 parts per million molecules, but he thinks it can be done, and if it can be done, it has a big advantage because then you don't need pipelines and to transport it. You put the collectors in places right above fault lines and places where you can geologically sequester directly. We have experiments underway in Iceland for basaltic sequestration of CO2, and there are many places that it would be very convenient if you could take it straight from the air and put it underground, and that would make the world safe for fossil fuels. In general, there's nothing wrong with fossil fuels. This is not a moral question. Except the CO2 issue. I mean, using fossil fuels would be great. It's gotten us a long way in the world, except it's dangerous if we don't clean up. And so CCS is an extremely important potential technology for doing this. I think the overall logic of what to do is fairly clear. And the overall logic is to clean up our power grid and convert our internal combustion to some form of electricity, because cars can't capture their own CO2 out of their exhaust pipe. So if we want to handle the 20 to 25% of CO2 that's emitted from our transport sector, the transport sector has to use a low-carbon power source. And that can be electrification, it could be fuel cells in principle, it could be biofuels on a small scale, though probably not on a large scale. You need to tip the balance to get in the direction we need to go by making market signals send us in that direction rather than in the current direction. But the market signals are pretty clear right now, which is if you want base load energy, burn coal. It's cheap, it gives you reliable electricity at the lowest possible cost, your industry will be competitive, and our planet will end up destroying itself. So we need to put a signal that is much more powerful and at the same time do a lot of research and development at a pre-commercial stage to figure out which of these pathways is viable and at what cost. So it's not enough, by the way, to just put a price on carbon. We have to make societal decisions as well. For example, what do we think of nuclear power? Who's in favor? I am. Anybody else? Okay, a few people. Who's against? All right, the price of carbon will not decide this question. We're going to need to vote, to debate it. We're going to need to have a plan. There are valid arguments on both sides of this issue. But we better decide it, and it's not enough to have cap and trade to decide it. We actually need to have a public decision-making and much more rational scrutiny of that option. And in many other technologies, we are going to need, if we're going to deploy them, we need public right-of-ways, we need high-voltage transmission lines, we need to carry wind from the Dakotas to the populated centers, we need to, in this country, decide what we're going to do with the Mojave Desert, how many solar panels are going to fill the desert and in which way. I'm in favor. Of course, it requires decisions and then public investment because not too many people live in the Mojave. And so you have to take the energy out someplace, and that requires right-of-ways, land management, public decisions, ecosystem protection, and so forth. So what do people here think about the U.S. energy plan, the Obama plan? Have you read it? It doesn't exist. It doesn't, no, all of the above is not a plan. All of the above is to get past the election. There is no plan whatsoever here. It's worse than my first-year students by far, who easily can put together spreadsheets and give options and decide what to do. We have a Nobel laureate Secretary of Energy in this country. Who has seen him recently? Of course, the whole idea is he might say something real, and that could upset somebody, and that could trigger advertisements, that could trigger super PACs. So we have nothing, no plans, no documents, no strategy, no honest speeches, no discussion at all. I've never seen anything like it. It's almost a complete collapse of politics in this country. Or I should say, it's almost a complete collapse of policy in this country. There is no policy. By design, by the way. Policy is dangerous. Somebody might object. Somebody might not contribute to the campaign. And so neither side says a word right now. But 4 years later, and this president wanted to do something. Now, the one thing they tried to do was the wrong thing. I just want to come back to what the panel was saying. Cap and trade is the wrong approach for this issue. Absolutely the wrong approach. Because what cap and trade does is it puts a spot price on an issue that needs a 25-year price. And so these cap and trade systems were all designed for one reason, which is that American politicians didn't want to say tax. And so they said cap and trade as if that would somehow make this magically better politically. But of course it made it a lot worse because the cap and trade system is completely unconvincing as a way to handle a technological transformation over a 25 or 30-year period. An analogy was made with the sulfur oxide reductions of the 1990s, which used cap and trade. But that's a completely different phenomenon from carbon emissions. The reason is that sulfur oxide emissions are a flow pollutant. They don't stay up in the air. In fact, they come down in the rain and cause acid rain. And so if you put a current price on, you instigate a current decision to put a smokestack scrubber on, and you get the result that you want, which is reduction of sulfur oxides. With CO2, though, you don't want to define today's level of CO2 emissions. What we really care about is the emissions 20 years from now. What will our power system look like? Will we have made a transformation fundamentally? It actually doesn't matter so much what we emit today, because that's given, that's baked into our infrastructure, our energy systems, our buildings, our power plants, our cars. The question is, what are we going to have 20 years from now? And today's price doesn't determine that. The price 20 years from now determines that. And the regulatory environment of what kind of power plants are going to be built determines that. So we need a strategy very different from this cap and trade. And this is why Australia's done the right thing to put a carbon tax, but then the wrong thing to say by 2015 it becomes cap and trade. What? Just keep what you have and get the rest of the world off of this system that doesn't work, because it is not transforming our technology. It is not making the deeper choices evident. It's not promoting the technological changes that are needed. I'll just say one final word about this. There is something that is, of course, absolutely weird about most of the choices we make on this issue. I said it's just about the most complicated thing imaginable, except for one point that I could have stressed much more. And that is that if we really went to all the next best alternatives, even using today's technologies, we could probably decarbonize the energy system substantially at a cost of maybe 2% of our GNP. That's a big cost. In the United States, we're a $15 trillion economy, and so 1% is 150 billion, so $300 billion a year of outlays. People would raise their eyebrows at that. But for a $15 trillion economy, it's actually not such a big deal. It's not worth wrecking the planet for example. In other words, the issue is complicated because it requires decisions. It requires collective action. It requires pathways. It requires the change of how we do things. It requires taking on vested interests. It requires new technologies. That's what makes it complicated. Not that it's going to break the world economy, that it's going to destroy our countries, that it's going to be the end of prosperity or anything like that. The only thing that could end prosperity is business as usual. If we just took on full speed the changeover with what we have right now, we could do it, and the truth is we'd barely notice. Although shareholders of some companies would take pretty heavy losses, a lot of congressmen would be voted out of office. It might be quite interesting, actually. But it would not break our economy or our society. So there is fundamentally good news, which is that we have a lot of ways to proceed. We have a lot of solutions on the drawing board. We have a lot of things that are so exciting, actually, that in the end, even though we will bear a cost to do this, we will still come out a happier, healthier, more robust society in the end, not only for having avoided the worst, but actually for having introduced more exciting technologies. I know you talked about green buildings and energy efficiency. I would add that electric vehicles add a startlingly exciting horizon for us in new forms of transport that are going to be much higher quality. Indeed, that newspaper that I like so much, the Wall Street Journal, and I like it, I really like it, except for its miserable 3 pages, had a wonderful insert today about the inevitability of self-driving vehicles. As my engineering colleague says, it's dangerous to text and to drive at the same time, so stop driving. That's what the technology is going to allow to do. And because it's electric, you can do wonderful things that you can't do with mechanical transmission and internal combustion engines. So we're going to come out ahead of the game. This is not the end of prosperity. This is actually an exciting venue ahead, but we're going to have to take some decisions, and we haven't been able to take them yet. And my thought as I continue to look around is that maybe in the end the United States will be, or maybe Washington will be, the last place to act on the planet, sad to say. But even within the United States, many places are wanting to move ahead. They're not waiting for China, they're not waiting for Washington. They want to have a clean and responsible energy system, even if it's more costly for them right now. They know that ultimately the world's going to have to move in that direction, and better to be an early mover than a late mover. And I find all over the world that there are early movers who are ready to step up right now. So maybe we'll feel better when we pay attention not so much to these UN processes of which I'm a part, where we wait for total unanimity, which never comes, but rather we start championing those who will move ahead first, draw attention to them, give support to them, and make the dynamic who can get there fastest, because in the end, those are going to be the ones that are going to benefit most. Thanks very much.